I know you're upset that you haven't made the first team squad. You just won't reach in the 30-metre throw. That's really important in our game. Obviously, I need to be able to rely on you. Have you ever heard of
biomechanics?
But yeah, I have a few mates who are professionals at biomechanics, and I think I can refer you to them, and they can give you some constraints that can help you grow.
Hey Dale, how you going?
Yeah, James, nice to meet you.
Coach Blaze put me onto you because I just needed a bit of help with my throwing technique. I didn't make the first team because I can't really throw the 30 metres and I want to be a quarterback, so I heard that you could maybe give me a bit of assistance.
Yeah, definitely I can give you assistance. First of all, have you got the money?
Newton's first law of inertia is the idea that an object wants to keep doing what it's already doing. So if an object is at rest, it wants to continue to be at rest, and if it is moving, the object wants to continue to move. This object would continue to move, however, other forces such as friction, gravity, and wind resistance cause this object to come to a stop. To overcome the inertia of an object, we have to apply an unbalanced force. Newton's second law is the idea of how fast an object will move. Acceleration of an object depends on the mass of the object and the amount of force applied to move this object. In mathematical terms, this is force equals mass times acceleration. To make an object accelerate or speed up, a force must be applied. The more force that is applied, the quicker the object will accelerate. As well as this, the mass of the object will also determine how much force is needed to make the object move. Newton's third law states that for every action there is an equal or opposite reaction. This means that when two bodies interact, they apply forces to one another that are equal in magnitude or opposite in direction. An example of this is when a ball is dropped on the ground, the action is the ball hitting the ground, and the reaction is the ground pushing up on the ball with the same force. Newton's first two laws can be seen in the game of NFL, and more specifically the NFL throw. Newton's first law with the idea that an object wants to stay at rest is relevant as the NFL ball wants to stay at rest until an unbalanced force, like the thrower, acts upon the object and throws the ball. Once the ball is in the air, it also experiences Newton's first law that other forces such as friction, gravity, and wind resistance act upon the ball, making it hit the ground and come to a stop. Newton's second law can be seen in how far and fast the ball is thrown. The equation of force equals mass times acceleration gives the idea that the more force applied in throwing the NFL ball, the faster the ball will fly through the air, thus increasing the distance of the throw. Since the mass of the ball doesn't change, the force applied to the ball is the main variable that affects the distance and the speed the ball will travel.
As we can see from James's trial throws, he is currently unable to throw the pass in excess of 30 metres. This is due to his throwing stance, where he faces the throwing direction and thus limits the potential speed and force produced during each throw. This lack of distance is directly attributed to his inability to correctly fire a sequence of muscles starting from the larger muscles down to his smaller muscles. This is called the summation and sequencing of forces. If James is able to incorporate more muscle groups into each throw and fire each group of muscles in a sequence so that they add to the total force produced in each throw, he'll be achieving a longer throwing distance.
Summation and sequencing of forces is a linear pattern of individual muscle groups producing force progressively, adding to the previous muscle's force. We want each muscle group to fire while the previous muscle group is at maximum acceleration to create greater force during the throw. So for example, if we were looking at James's throw, initially he propels his torso forward, followed by his lead arm down, his arm forward and with the wrist. So we're seeing a motion of propelling that torso forward. From there he's adding on the front or lead hand coming down. The next one is obviously his arm coming forward, and finally his wrist throwing the ball. So as we can see over time, his increasing acceleration and producing more force behind that ball. Unfortunately, he's not producing enough force. An example of this is James throwing a ball 10 metres to another player. He must use summation and sequencing of forces to produce enough force to move the ball to the other player. This is an example of Newton's second law, where the player must produce enough force and speed to overcome the mass of the ball.
The correct sequencing and firing of muscles will allow the force from each muscle group to add to the previous muscle's exerted force. This creates optimal force to reach its intended target. We can see James and Ethan unsuccessfully making passes to each other. When James and Ethan let go of the ball too early, force is lost and the mass of the ball is greater than the acceleration of the ball, and the ball drops to the floor. To improve James's summation and sequencing of forces, I'm implementing a constraint that will alter James's starting position. This position will allow James to incorporate more muscles into each throw. James is asked to begin with this in a starting position where the ball and his elbow are simultaneously touching the post. The second instruction was to throw the ball as far as possible, with each record throw being marked. This forces James to self-organize through an external focus of control and to find a mechanically superior starting position and throwing pattern. As you can see, this constraint forces James to square up his shoulders with the throwing direction. This position will allow James to incorporate previously unused muscles into his throw whilst enabling him to maintain balance. Movement of the larger muscles in his legs and trunk will help him produce extra force when throwing the gridiron ball. As James progresses, you can see him self-organize his movement patterns to the open loop feedback. James uses this feedback to change his throwing technique to improve his throwing distance by incorporating more muscles using summation and sequencing of forces. As we can see in Constraint 1, James is beginning to self-organize his movements to find new successful attractor states. The sequence of movements James produces is lead leg extension, hip rotation, lead arm abducting, torso rotation, load arm propelling forward, and hand rotation. The summation of forces is creating torque through the ball and through the carrying arm to produce maximum force and acceleration on the ball.
Torque is the force applied to a lever to move an object. In this case, the lever is James's arm, and his arm is classified as a third-class lever. The movement of a third-class lever is dependent on three components. These components are the fulcrum, the force, and the load. On James, we have the fulcrum, which is his shoulder joint, which gives him a range of movement. The force is his rotator cuff muscles in his back, and the load is the ball. The advantage of the third-class lever is that it has a larger range of motion. The increase in the length of the lever decreases the mechanical advantage of motion and allows James to exert more force onto the load. Initially, James was unable to incorporate larger muscle groups into his trial throw due to the stance, which forced him to arch backwards in a bid to impart more force on the ball. As you can see here, James will get in the starting position. As he's leaning backwards, he's got less stability because of his line of gravity is closer to the edge of his base of support. As we can see here, in a neutral position, James would have a line of gravity straight down into his feet, okay, straight down. Whereas in the initial throw, in the trial throws, he was bent back, and that gravity, that line of gravity, is closer to the back, coming through here, and his center of mass is now outside of his body. Okay? The constraint that I've implemented forces James to stand with his shoulders square with the throwing direction, and creates more stability through his legs and keeping him in a more neutral position for his line of gravity. The emergent behavior sees James twisting through his torso, standing over and rotating through that line of gravity, keeping the center of mass closer to his body and his base of support. This enables him to maintain greater stability through the course of the throwing movement, and James keeps his center of mass within his body and increases the stability during the motion. So go through the motion without throwing the ball. Yep. And he's quite stable, I can't push him over.
This freedom of movement and balanced state James is now achieving is allowing him to create maximum angular momentum. Angular momentum is the quantity of rotation applied to a body or a lever. The more angular momentum, the greater the force produced. In James's case, because he's using a third-class lever, the load must pivot faster than the fulcrum point. If a ball is swinging around on a piece of string, we notice that the ball always maintains an adjacent position to the string closest to the fulcrum. The ball must travel a greater distance than the string at the fulcrum. This forces the ball to accelerate to a speed where it can maintain the same position as the string at the pivot point. So too with the gridiron ball, James is creating angular momentum, which in turn is accelerating the ball at a speed which is much higher than the speed from the moving fulcrum joint. During constraint 1, it is evident that James is moving along two planes, the transverse plane and the frontal plane, during the throwing sequence.
The frontal plane is a line which separates the body into anterior and posterior halves, anterior front and posterior back. This plane allows for lateral side movement, adduction and abduction. Adduction is towards the body, abduction is away from the body. Pause there.
During constraint 1, abduction is also evident as James's lead leg steps away from his body when beginning the throwing sequence. Elevation and adduction is also evident as he brings his lead arm downwards towards his body during the throw. Elevation of the throwing arm must also be noted as a movement along the frontal plane.
The transverse plane splits the body into head and tail, as you can see here. This plane allows for rotation above and below the imaginary line. It also allows for pronation and supination.
James displays rotation through his torso during the sequence of the throw. James starts with a ball-holding hand in a supination position. During the throw, he rotates his torso and rotates his hands and transfers it into a pronation position as he tries to impart rotation on the ball. As James advances through the constraints, he experiences decay as he's found a movement solution to the problem through newly developed attractor wells, which help him to throw efficiently and effectively.
Good to see you, mate.
Good to see you as well. What can I help you with?
Look, I'm working with this kid called James at the moment. I'm not going to lie. He's bloody hopeless. All right. So I was just wondering if you can look at a couple of videos to check out his biomechanics and see what you can do for him.
I can do that, mate. Anything for an old friend?
Oh, wow.
He's a ripping young lad.
You're not wrong. He's a good-looking lad.
Yeah, no, he's definitely got some issues there. Luke doesn't got a clue, does he? But yeah, I would love to help you, mate. I reckon he could be a real star of the future if he improves that hand grip.
Well, I'll definitely give him your number. I've got to shoot off. I've got dinner with the missus. But it was nice seeing you, mate.
Nice to see you as well. See you soon.
Bye.
Dale has introduced springing the ball higher and behind the head. This also increasing the shoulder abduction. This is important to my area that the production of maximal forces requires use of all possible joint movements that contribute to the task objective. This applies to all phases when generating a throw. Now, however, it can be seen that although this is working, his physical attributes don't allow him to throw it in his current state. In order for James to operate spin, I've come up with 3 ideas that you will see throughout this part. In order to help James, the use of environmental and task constraints will be undertaken to enable James to undertake a variety of movements that allow him to improve on his distance throwing. Now, one of the main reasons why James wasn't picked in this team was because he wasn't requiring the right distance. This is very much because of the amount of spin he has on the ball. He hardly has any. We're going to be talking about why spin is important and how this can be implemented in his training program. This image shows the difference of particle flow around different shaped objects, indicating that the object with the longer leading edges separates the particles. It identifies 2 important aspects of flow separation and laminar flow. As you can see, the image above shows how the smaller area doesn't separate as much when the area is less size, meaning it limits the amount of drag and friction. However, the image at the bottom, the separation is a lot larger due to the size of the bus, creating more drag and friction. However, this image shows the difference between laminar and turbulent flow depending on the shape of the object's backside. In this case, the image below would best describe what is occurring in an NFL ball whilst in the air, as the shape at the front of the ball is the same as the shape at the back of the ball, allowing it to go through 3 stages, being laminar flow, flow separation, and laminar flow, as the ball continues through the air.
Unlike a spherical ball, the shape actually helps the football to spiral through the geoscopic effect, which helps maintain its control and trajectory by its continual spin. A A spiraling football is also affected through moving through the air because it reduces the amount of drag or air friction against the ball. Now, as the football spirals, the air friction on the surface is broken up. So as we can see here, as the ball is moving, like it's spinning, the air is coming in and going around the ball, broken up into two sections. Just here. Going around the ball. The rotation tends to break up the boundary layer between the fixed air and the football surface, which reduces drag. But as the football is thrown, even if the football is thrown a little bit off, it tends to wobble like this, which encounters more drag and does not benefit the time in the air. So if I've got the ball and it's kind of, wobbling, it creates more surface area to the mind to hit it. Now, the tighter the spiral, the less air resistance on the ball, allowing it to travel further. Without the spiral, it would be very difficult to keep the football on the right path and also distance.
Hey mate, nice to meet you, Ethan.
Nice to meet you.
I've had a word with Dale. Geez, you're even bigger in person. Yeah, I've had a word with Dale. There's a few things that I can help with your biomechanics. Should we get into it?
Yeah, I think so.
First of all, have you got the...
Oh, yeah. Yep.
Let's go.
Fine.
So when I watched your video analysis, James, I noticed that you were holding the ball in a bit of a funny way. Now, I won't tell you how to throw it. I'm going to let you self-adapt to what I'm saying.
Okay.
So when you throw, all I want you to do is to grip it. All I want these two fingers on this part here, just two, and you can do that. And then when you throw it, I want your hand to finish with your thumb on your hip.
Okay.
Very simple drill. Just nice and over on your hip. Okay, and you can see how you go.
Okay.
So just
The throwing follow-through is derived from momentum. As the force generated through the throw is transferred into the ball, the throwing arm will hold the momentum and follow through after the ball is released. The greater the force produced in the throwing movement, the greater the momentum followed through from the throw. For this, I very much used open loop control. This type of control system sends certainly determined pre-structured commands to the effector and runs without feedback. It is used for rapid, discrete movements. As you can see in the video, me and James are throwing multiple balls to each other for James to use the use of repetition and make the desired movements that make it better for him. The point of James touching his hip allows James to really crank his arm and fingers in order to rip spin on the ball. The attractor in terms of human coordinated movement characterizes preferred behavioral state, such as in phases for rhythmic binual finger movements. The production of joints in order from the largest to the smallest helps James when producing a larger throw. Angular momentum is consistent when an athlete or object is free in the air. This object is the ball when it is released from James's hand. We can see in this video the progress that James has made. He is able to reach the desired distance while also in addition releasing it with spin.
The aim of this constraint is to incorporate the previously learned constraints that address the original problem of the lack of distance in the pass and apply them into a more representative situation to increase the accuracy of the pass. As well as increasing distance, it is still important to maintain accuracy to ensure the pass is going directly to the player or where the player needs to be. So the aim of this constraint is for the thrower to throw into 3 zones scattered around the field that are 30 metres away, which is just out of the region that the player could originally throw. So the hiker will hike the ball to the thrower. The hiker will call left, centre or right, and whatever position the hiker calls is which position the thrower has to throw to. So if the hiker says right, the thrower will then grab the ball, self-organise, adjust, and throw the ball into the right area. So Coach Blade suggested that I do some goal setting to reach my goal of making the NFL's first team. So he suggested using this format of the outcome goal, performance goal, and process goal to get myself there. So my outcome goal for this whole constraint-based learning would be to make the NFL first teams for the next season, which is in 5 weeks' time. So I've got a bit of time to practice and get my abilities up, but I'll get there soon. So my performance goal for this would be to just accurately throw the NFL ball 30 metres, which is what Coach Blaze asked me to do to work on to be in the first team. So So the process goal involved with this framework would be to continue to implement the previously learned constraints of the grip on the ball and the summation of forces and balance. So those could be implemented in the next constraint that Coach Blaze gives me. So when implementing my next constraint, I'll keep this framework in mind, especially the process goal of implementing the previously learned constraints to help me with my NFL throw.
Yep. Stand up.
In this constraint, the aim is to change the context from throwing as far as possible to creating a slightly more representative situation and throwing accurately to different areas on the field. As well as being more representative, this task also involves perception-action coupling with the idea that the thrower will need to perceive and move to wherever the hiker has thrown the ball and recognize that the ball will not always get thrown perfectly into his hands. As can be seen in the footage, the first constraint can be seen in the preparation of the throw, with the shoulders being square to where I will throw, my feet are shoulder width apart, and my elbow coming into a 90-degree angle. My summation of forces can be seen in the way I throw my ball, with the big muscles being used first down into the smaller muscles. The second constraint can be seen in the way I follow through with my arm to touch my hip to really get a rip on the ball to ensure I get lots of spin so it glides through the air. This results in a more accurate pass that cuts through the air. The idea that movements happen so quick that there is next to no time for feedback to influence or make adjustments for the successful completion of a movement task is called an open loop model. This describes the movements that occur so quickly that the feedback loop cannot help modify the movements to enhance success. While performing this action, I am demonstrating an open loop model, as once I've performed the action, there is no opportunity for me to receive feedback via the brain or muscles to change the action that I'm performing. The only feedback I receive is visual feedback in regards to where the ball lands and if it hits the target.
Alright class, we'll wrap it up there. In conclusion, it is inconclusive to tell that the chicken comes before the egg or the egg comes before the chicken. I'll see you next week.
Still Snoop Dogg and D.I.
Alright, how you feeling?
Yeah, feeling good, feeling confident.
Yeah, that's good, mate. I've looked at your video analysis. A few games you've been playing. You've been really hitting those 5 throws that need you to throw to be accurate. And I'm welcoming you into the team this weekend for your debut.
Alright, let's go boys! Yeah! Woo!
I'll see you training this afternoon.
Don't you forget about